Hi there, today on Typical Books I want to talk about horror and why it's not scary anymore. It's not entirely true. We know horror can be scary. We like it because it's scary. We liked it because it scared us when we were kids, or we're looking for the next thing. We're chasing the dragon, so to speak, and trying to find the next scary thing. Or maybe we're all just so desensitized it doesn't even count as horror anymore. This is a critique I see all the time in the horror community. Horror just isn't scary anymore, or recommend me a book that's actually scary. And then there's a big list of books that people like. It's like you just recommend your favorite book when someone asks you that, or you ask them what scares them. And sometimes they can articulate that, but sometimes not. And maybe they don't even know why scary books aren't scaring them anymore, or even if they were meant to in the first place. You see it in reviews, Reddit threads, BookTube comments, people asking for recommendations that will finally actually really scare them. Like there's one perfect book out there that will actually do the trick. Some people have literally bought into the marketing copy and want a white-knuckle thrill ride of scares. That might just be impossible. Fear is incredibly personal. And what terrified one person might fall flat for another person. And what might even be more important for a seasoned reader of horror is that they're not looking, or we're not looking, for 100% scares all of the time. This is just a genre that we prefer. It's not always about fear. It's about atmosphere and tension and projection and characters and dark imagination and dark themes. So I pulled together 7 reasons of why horror may not be scaring you anymore. If you're one of those people that have posted one of those threads saying, this book wasn't scary, I like this book but it wasn't scary, can you recommend a book that is actually scary? And you find that horror might not be scaring you, we'll explore why that's not necessarily a bad thing. The first thing is that you still want childhood scares to still work. Grimm's fairy tales terrified me as a kid. Scary stories to tell in the dark. If it wasn't the pictures and the ideas in these stories, they scared the heck out of me as a kid. Scooby-Doo scared me as a kid. Ricky Tikki Tavi scared me as a kid. Watership Down, Plague Dogs, those sorts of things were a real horror. The Dark Crystal, very scary as a kid. Those sorts of things certainly won't work now. But if you're also that kid like me in grade 3 reading Pet Sematary, those things just don't work anymore. That terrifying clown, the monster under the bed, the idea of being home alone, those sorts of fears just hit you very differently as a child, and they don't necessarily carry over to being a grown-up. Adult horror tends to dig deeper into themes of isolation and loss and mortality. Expecting childhood scares to still work on you the way that they used to may leave you feeling underwhelmed. Now, of course, we can still revisit our old Goosebumps and Fear Street books and have fun with it, but we're not necessarily scared. We may also be able to recapture a little bit of that spine-tingling, white-knuckled thrill we felt as a kid, but it's not the same. We're not genuinely being scared. So if you're going to them looking to be scared, you may be disproportionately underwhelmed. Another reason, number 2, is that you might be desensitized. Here's a nice selection of books that shall desensitize you. Gone to See the Riverman, Womb, wonderful book. Dead Inside, everyone loves that. And The Summer I Died, which is coming up on my list very soon because I need to flesh out my extreme horror starter pack reading. But yeah, you could be desensitized. Desensitization was such a buzzword in the 90s, wasn't it? You were desensitized to violence because of video games. But the more horror you consume, the harder it could be to shock you. Shocking, I know, haha. But no, it's more intrinsic to the craft than that. You start to see the scaffolding. You start to see behind the curtain. You get to see what's behind the scares. That predictability kind of starts to make the whole genre feel a little more flat. Not always that you know what's coming, but you understand what the tricks of the trade are as far as building tension. You understand what the tricks of the trades are with not showing the monster. You understand the tricks of the trade when it comes to having cliffhangers after every single chapter. This is also true with life experience. After visiting a few dark rides, carnival horror may not be as scary. After real life trauma, say a horrific car accident, some stories may not work for you the same way. Number 3, you're playing detective. And this I find being a problem with the younger generation for the most part. I saw a lot of complaints about we used to live here. People saw everything coming. They knew the twists. They knew stories like it so they could anticipate what was happening. And sometimes when what you anticipate happening doesn't, then you're all the more frustrated by it, and it's not scary. Heads will roll. For some people, it was really fun. They could get lost in the ride, even if they figured out who the killer was. A lot of people figured out who the killer was, or the loose story and the twist or the mystery here, and they were frustrated, and it wasn't scary. Clown in a Cornfield, I know I'm holding up number 3, but the whole series, really. There's things about this that people would try to figure out. Maybe this was a little harder mystery to figure out for the horror detectives out there, but people tended to have fun with it and give it a pass and let it go, that they could figure it out beforehand. Those aren't the only examples, of course. There's lots of books people are frustrated with or find not scary because they're playing detective. Instead of being a victim or guessing the ending, you're dissecting the plot, and that turns horror into a puzzle. Now that analytical mindset that can be so fun, I mean, I like a good puzzle, it disrupts the tension and it offsets the actual horror and dulls the emotional impact. Some people, I suspect, do this on purpose, whether they're doing it subconsciously or not, because they want to dull the tension. They don't want to actually be scared. They're very worried that they're going to be triggered. So they approach this like a puzzle to be figured out, solved, or beaten. And they may not even realize that this is what's lessening the impact of horror or thrillers. I love a good puzzle, but it certainly can lead to dampening the scares. And number 4 is one of my favorites. You expect a physical reaction from a psychological process. There are 7,000 trillion million billion books I could pull out to illustrate this, and I am no doctor of horror. I am not university educated in the realm of which I'm speaking at this moment, or any moment, quite honestly. But, you know, something like Jeff Strand Pressure, I think of this because I read it recently. Very gory, very psychologically motivated, but this could be the sort of thing that someone would read and feel that they're not scared by it because they didn't get the revulsion. Their skin didn't prickle. They didn't have chills literally running down their spine. They weren't white-knuckled while reading it. Slob by Rex Miller. If you've read a lot of like really contemporary extreme horror and you're after something very grotesque and hard-hitting original splatterpunk, this is a really good hit, but it might not work for many people because they're expecting to literally run for the toilet. They're expecting to feel their gorge rising. They're expecting to throw up in their mouth a little tiny bit. And there's scenes in here that should elicit that, quite honestly. But I'm also saying that tongue-in-cheek. I didn't literally feel ill. I've watched a lot of movies in the anticipation, knowing that they were extremely revolting extreme horror films. And I had a glass of water just in case, but, you know, and I have specific triggers for that sort of thing. Film works a little different. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you're reading this expecting a physical horror reaction, and it's all taking place in your head, and you're disappointed by that. That could be a reason why you're finding horror not scary. The rats, and this touches on sort of the age as well of these books, in that things that scared people decades ago maybe don't scare them the same way anymore, or it takes a certain ramping up of tension and gore and terror and horror to actually work, perhaps. But reading something like this, it does have some very gory scenes. You might find yourself not being scared by it because, again, you're not having a physical reaction. Horror doesn't always have to come with goosebumps or a racing heart. Some of the most effective horror lingers in your thoughts or has a real slow build and sense of unease. If you're waiting for that jolt, you might miss that sense of dread that's creeping in. Like, have you ever literally read a jump scare on the page? If you have, let me know in the comments below. I have written a jump scare that worked on one person, but I don't get notes from every single person that reads that paragraph I wrote that gave that one person a real literal jump scare where they put their hand to their mouth and went, "Oh my God," kind of thing. Not everyone has that reaction, so it's extremely rare, I'd have to say, because you're reading and you're writing the movie in your head as you read. You're not just passively observing when you're reading a book like a film, perhaps, where you don't have the chance to write the film in your head while you're watching one. You are, though, when you're reading a book. So you have a lot of anticipation of what's going to happen next, which also works with number 5, you're bracing yourself too much. And this could be part of the problem with people reading books that they've been recommended, or they specifically said, I need a book that will scare me. You said this will scare me, and now I dare you. I fucking dare you. Scare me. You want to know a book that really literally scared me? Not a book, a story. Sticks by Karl Edward Wagner. I read this as a teen. It still has a great amount of unease for me. I want to take walks in the forest and make myself be scared after reading it every time I read it, whether I listen to it as an audio play or read it like I have several times. I do highly recommend it, but someone will inevitably go into that with the mindset of, I dare you now, Sticks, to scare me. Maybe you've watched The Monkey. I know I have, and I loved it. It's not scary, but you might go into that and then be like, oh, the master of horror. I dare you to scare me, Stephen King. And he even points right at you during the trailer for Maximum Overdrive and says he's gonna scare the hell out of you. I mean, if that doesn't set you up for failure, I don't know what does. Especially if you're a seasoned horror fan, you might go into things like these short stories and not get the scares you want and be disappointed. I would say that these are some of the best horror books I've read in the last little while, last year specifically. So, I mean, are they scary though? Will they actually scare you? Are these the sort of books that you are putting that marker on, saying that it will scare you, like really horrify you? Maybe you find them just gentle, easy reading. If you're reading horror with the mindset of, I dare you to scare me, and you're putting up a wall, good luck. Horror really relies on immersion or projection, as I'd like to think of it, at its best. If you're on guard the whole time, or at worst in denial that it will scare you, then you're not putting your best foot forward and you've doomed the story to fail. Unless, of course, you're very easy to scare. But this is a good example, Sticks by Karl Edward Wagner. A lot of people agree it's very scary. It scared a lot of people when they first read it, whether they were a young teen or a seasoned reader of horror. There's something to do with the style here, but I think it's also you're allowing this to scare you, and you have to sort of make that concession, that deal that you're making with this devil that is horror. You're letting it in and you're letting it scare you. You have to be open to that. If you're not open to letting horror scare you, I don't believe that it can really work. And that could be the problem with some people who are reading books and then looking for recommendations of books that will actually scare them because they did not make that deal with the last book they read. Point number 6 could be that you're not actually reading horror at all. These are some really good examples of books that are considered horror or horror adjacent. I think of American Psycho in this light as well. The Terror by Dan Simmons. It's a historical fiction in a way, and that's all it is, really. The horrors of the North, perhaps. And it can be very scary. It's not necessarily horror, though. So if you read this and go, well, where are all the ghosts? Where are all the ghouls? Where's the real monster if you don't consider polar bears or the cold itself a monster? This might not work for you. Sundial by Katrina Ward. A lot of people don't consider horror. I found it very terrifying. I found it very scary. But of course, I didn't jump out of my seat or run for the toilet. I wasn't white-knuckled, and I didn't, walk around jumping at shadows for a week. It's not that sort of horror. Some people might consider it not horror at all, and House of Leaves, I don't consider horror in the slightest. A lot of people complain specifically of House of Leaves not scaring them, and a lot of people complain of House of Leaves as scaring them too much. So which is it? But really, at the end of the day, I don't believe that it's horror. I mean, I suppose it is cosmic horror. It's also cosmically impossible to read, isn't it? I mean, I guess it could be considered cosmic horror, for sure. I just didn't find any of the horror elements that I look for in horror. And those are just a few standouts that I could pull off my shelf. There's, again, a lot of examples of this. Some so-called horror titles are more like a thriller, a mystery, or a dark fantasy. A lot of the times, horror is found within the crime section. Here's kind of a dark fantasy that is horror adjacent that some people might have thought was a horror novel and may have been disappointed it didn't scare them. If you're not reading books that are actually designed to scare you, it's no surprise that you're not feeling it. Sure, some books that are not horror, like The Terror, are incredibly scary, but then there's some books that people are calling cozy horror or goosebumps for adults, and they're designed to be light on the terror and very light on the scares and very little gore, so it's not a wonder that you don't find them scary. The final bonus, number 7, you're not letting horror get personal. You're not letting it in. And I've talked about briefly previously about making that deal with it and letting horror in. You really do have to shake hands with your devil and invite it in to allow it to work for you. And it depends on what that is, right? For you, that works for you specifically. There is a point in Head Full of Ghosts, one of the least scary books ever, I think, that has a scene that worked like a jump scare for me, that unsettled me deeply and was scary. And it had me thinking about a specific thing barely related to the book or the subject, to do with my family and my sister. And it brought up a childhood memory. It was just a really wild thing for a paragraph in a book to do. And it was me letting it in, and it was a personalized, very personalized scare that the author might not have thought would work on many people, and I've never heard anyone talk about that specific scene in the way that it worked for me. What scares you might not work for someone else, and vice versa. So if you're reading only recommendations based on what other people have recommended as scary books, and you're finding that they're not working, you might be missing what would genuinely be getting under your skin. Or you might be limiting yourself by avoiding things that might actually scare you. Horror works and lands the hardest when it taps into something intimate and something very real for you as the reader. But that only really works if you let your guard down and let it in. You could work with books that are cosmic horror or horror adjacent, or even true crime or science fiction if you find horror as the genre doesn't scare you and that's what you're looking for. I find a lot of terrifying ideas in the lighter side of horror, or like I said, science fiction can be incredibly scary, especially if you're worried of isolation and things like that, or you have deep xenophobia. That, or it could just be that you need a break from the genre. And I don't really recommend stepping away from horror because it's a wonderful place to be, but you could try other genres like true crime, historical fiction and nonfiction, or science fiction, as mentioned, just as a change of pace and to find what sort of terror works for you on a different level. So if horror isn't scaring you like it used to, or doesn't scare you at all, that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're not working, or that the books you are reading are broken, or that people can't recommend scary books to you properly. That's not what it means at all. It doesn't mean that the genre is failing or has changed. Horror works in layers. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's just about exploring the dark ideas. Let me know in the comments what the last book was that scared you very, very much, or if you are very easily scared by horror and have to keep it extremely light, or if, like me, you don't really actually feel scared when reading horror. It's just a comforting genre that you've come to know very well. No matter what side of the spectrum you lie on with that, I'm sure like me you can agree that a book doesn't need to be scary to be a good book. This is just a genre that we really enjoy, whether it comes across as scary or just kind of cozy and comfortable, something that we're used to, right? So yes, let me know in the comments below if there's a book that has scared you, or you think will scare me, or you think that I ought to be reading. Thank you so much for watching, and have an ooky, spooky day.